on the emotional burden of something much. You're telling a story. It hurts my sentiments. That line hit the ground hard. Because at that point, the discussion shifted from memory to motivation. This was not confusion, according to the account. This wasn't miscommunication. While others had to deal with the aftermath, this person was fabricating a version of events to make themselves appear mistreated. And the consequences followed quickly. Inconsistencies were pointed out some viewers. Why was the narrative altered? Why did some names come and go? Based on how it's told. What caused the tone to go from informal to disastrous? The charge itself wasn't the most frightening aspect. It was the assurance that accompanied it. I assumed they wanted to be up there alone since they were kissing in the back of that damned car. I didn't go upstairs when we were dropped off at Tamar's place because of this. You were sitting on his lap in that goddamn Uber while you two were kissing. So I got in my stupid car and drove home. All right. Additionally, the underscore made me, oh no. The parent in the transcript that they were uneasy long before anything happened. Vicious, nor envious, just uncomfortable, observing exchanges that didn't feel comfortable. The headboard or whatever, and noticed underscore your ass from behind. All right, however, if somebody has to be looked into regarding what level of intimacy felt wrong, they had the impression that something was happening in front of them that they, but also didn't entirely comprehend. Paraphrased statement about the car's appearance and uncomfortable. No longer limited to that evening of that particular information about what might have been going on for a long time. The intimacy, the body language, and the moments that were dismissed as enough but now seem to have deep significance. At this point, Mendeecees' name began to circulate in unsettling ways. Through proximity, the fact that he was present, the fact that he was observed, and the fact that, according to the story, he was individuals present when things changed. The speaker exercises. They don't say they know what private. They really claim they are unsure. However, combined with the intensity of everything else being said, that ambiguity turns into a sort of indictment in and of itself. When upstairs is mentioned in a paraphrase. Social lighted up by that one detail because people filled in the blanks. On their own, as soon as the concept was mentioned, the propagation of theory as presumptions solidified. What had begun as criticism abruptly evolved into what felt like a public inquiry. However, what was claimed wasn't the most intense moment. It originated from what was rejected. The speaker vehemently refutes the notion that a tragic or violent event had taken place. They challenge the story of serious harm. They find it hard to believe that someone could both vividly describe what happened and pretend to be ignorant of it. Paraphrased reference to doubting the timeliness and harshness. The entire controversy revolved around that discrepancy. Because why the panic if nothing happened? Why the silence if something did occur? And why was everyone avoiding the truth if it lays somewhere in the middle? Reactions on the internet divided into camps. Some others took the story at face value, believing it to be the first time someone had said what others had been reluctant to say. Others said it was too messy, too emotional, and too reactive to be trustworthy. Then there were those who concentrated on the things that were completely unsaid. Where was the explanation? Where was the responsibility? And why had some people remained silent? That's as the news began to trend, along with Yandy's name. It wasn't because she spoke, but rather because she hadn't. Silence becomes a statement in and of itself in circumstances such as these, particularly when feelings are running hot, allegations are flying, and public opinion is beginning to take shape. This conjecture grew louder every hour that there was no answer. Each replayed clip increased the strain, and the headline was placed over it all. That would not go away. By the end of the program, everyone on the internet was prepared to believe assertions about testing, incarceration, and repercussions that no one on camera had personally confirmed. One, it was obvious that there was no longer a miscommunication between Tamar and me. You had that Spanish woman down in Miami shoot that video once. There is nobody's oral damage healed as rapidly between friends as yours did. It was now being unraveled in public. And the more profound individuals looked, the more awkward the questions grew, since someone wasn't just lying. They were defending something if even a portion of what was being said was true. This protection began in a section of the narrative. It would change. Entered through tone, the way some aspects were highlighted while others were carefully ignored. By the subject had already shifted by the time what was going on. Because the story was no longer about a perplexing night out at this point. It was concerning legitimacy. As the video went viral, more people watched it again, not to hear what was said, but to see what wasn't. Each pause seemed deliberate. Each adjustment felt heavy. Viewers leaned closer each time the speaker paused before concluding a statement. Uneasy, the paradoxes at the core of everything stood out the most. On the one hand, the public narrative was one of doubt, perplexity, and ignorance. Presented here, on the other hand, was accurate, complete with places, time frames, movements, and emotional response. There was note of that disparity. To doubting the timeliness and harshness. It was no longer what had happened, and altered the way the whole was perceived. Because viewers began to wonder why someone had no idea what had happened, giving a detailed account. Why speak confidently who left together? And what happened subsequently while claiming confusion. Additionally, it started to feel more and more like two versions of the same night merging the more people examined it. The two versions were strategic and emotive, respectively. At that point, the speaker's tone changed from reflecting to combat. The annoyance grew more intense. The words are more thoughtful. Moreover, for the first time, addressed the topic directly rather than skirting it. The notion that a story was being written rather than recalled. Paraphrased reference to pained sentiments and narrative development. Because it reframed everything. That statement had a greater impact than anything else that had been set up to that time. It implied that misunderstandings or confusion were not the problem. It was deliberate that someone had decided to portray the evening in a particular manner, fully aware of how it would be perceived online. The narrative then took on a more sinister tone. The speaker starts out by explaining why they don't understand the version being presented, why the feelings don't correspond with what happened, and why the response feels out of proportion to what is said to have happened. They doubt the urgency. Questioned by the facts were highlighted, went unnoticed. The moment perceptions of every Yandy, according to a paraphrase. This was more than just Tamar, and that one statement brought the whole thing back into the spotlight. It had nothing to do with what transpired that evening. It had to do with who paid the price might not have contributed to. And that's where Yandy comes into play. It's through absence rather than words. She remains silent. She doesn't answer. Nothing is corrected by her. And quiet becomes deafening in a story that is driven by conjecture. People started interpreting that quiet online. While some perceived it as avoidance, others regarded it as restraint. Some saw it as confirmation. Additionally, there was no stopping those interpretations once they began to proliferate. Time. The focus kept returning to Mendeecees. Not because of outright charges. None were produced, but since this proximity due to the individuals who, according to the narrative, were present at times that subject of debate. Here, the speaker exercises caution. They never assert that they are fully aware of what transpired. They actually say the opposite on a regular basis. However, the implication looms large. If anyone is aware of what transpired, it would be those who were present when the evening came to a conclusion. Speculation was sparked by that implication alone. In situations like this, social media did what it always does. It completed the gaps. People started making connections between things that might or might not have been there. Timelines were examined. Old clips came back to life. Munn's sold casual remarks were suddenly seen as proof. And before anyone could move, a new story had emerged to stall things down. One that had rumors of incarceration. One that supposedly contained tests. One that transformed doubt into presumed guilt. All of it was circulating quickly, but none of it was verified or confirmed. In the meantime, the speaker's frustration with Tamar and the situation as a whole seemed to be growing. Being painted as a part of a narrative they say they attempted to avoid and getting pulled into something they didn't request. At one point, it's evident that I'm frustrated. Not anger, not shouting, but tiredness. Dot is the type that arises when you feel as though your name is being dragged into an uncontrollable storm. However, those who are capable of providing clarification decide not to. And that is where this section's emotional core is located. Not through accusations, but rather because you feel compelled to speak because your silence is being used against you. The speaker makes it apparent that they never intended for this to be made public. They had no desire to defend themselves. They were unwilling to deal with conjecture. But it was impossible to remain silent once the story took flight. Because facts cease to matter once the internet determines that a story is true. And that's the reason this situation was so unstable. The listener is left with more questions than answers by the conclusion of this section of the narrative. Why was the narrative presented in this manner? Why did some details get more attention than others? Why hasn't the situation been made clear by anyone? And why does it seem like it's cited by all those involved? Above all, there is one that permeates everything. Why does everyone seem so terrified of the truth emerging if nothing really happened? One thing became evident as the strain increased. What transpired that evening would not be the subject of the next part of this tale. It would be about who would eventually speak up and what people were willing to. The story grew heavier the longer it was in the public. What started off as a now the strained explanation had become much more turbulent. Every word that had been said earlier was being repeated, reinterpreted, and put back together to create new meanings. The internet no longer awaited clarification. It had already begun drawing its own conclusions, and one unsettling reality lay at the heart of it all. But the story was becoming less and less clear as more people spoke. The discussion had strayed far from what was really said. The audience wasn't merely listening. No longer. They were looking into it. In an attempt to locate the point at which everything came to an end, they went through timelines, compared statements, and piled instances on top of one another. Making sense? The emotional imbalance was the most noticeable thing. The speaker sounded hurt, irritated, and nearly deceived. However, uneasy about how intensely personal the response felt. Considering how expressed their desire to remain completely out of the scenario, that contradiction persisted in humans. Why did this feel so intimate if it wasn't? Why was the tone so defensive if it wasn't about assigning blame? Why did the story feel like it was being tightly handled if nothing actually happened? The focus changed once more as those queries went around. It's time to address what was left unsaid. Tamar made no denials that specifically addressed the specifics under discussion. There was no precise chronology or statement refuting the version of events that was currently circulating on social media. Speculation quickly filled the void left by the lack of information. People began analyzing language. Why describe the night so precisely while claiming you have no idea what happened? Why make public statements without first verifying the information in private? A single remark has the power to slow down a story, so why let it spiral? The section that made things feel heavier than appeared. The constant suggestion that someone else, rather, had suffered the true harm. That thought hovered like a shadow in the distance, because the story took on a new significance when it was revealed that Yandy might have been the only one who was genuinely harmed by everything. Framed. It moved the emotional focus from drama to consequence. Abruptly, a night out was not the topic of discussion. It has to do with loyalty. Boundaries were at issue. It was about what takes place. When personal experience public stories, Yandy remained silent. No declaration, no explanation, and no effort to change the subject. That quiet developed into its own narrative. People started to interpret it online. Some thought it was self-control. Some believed it to be strategic. Some claimed that it was pain being dealt with in private. But the effect remained the same, regardless of how it was interpreted. Everything became louder in the quiet. DC's name, however, kept looming over the discussion. Not because of formal declarations, not because of evidence, but because of affiliation. He was brought up. He was there. It feels too quiet in the room. The kind of quiet that only occurs just before an explosion. The camera is in motion. Moment, it seems as though the speaker is unsure of how much information they are going to divulge. Tamar says she's not sure how to react and describes the evening in what begins as a composed explanation. Transforms into something heavier. The words slows. A straightforward night out soon seems less straightforward as the pauses get longer. A house, a ride choice that in the eyes of might have changed every thought initially seems disorganized, innocuous. However, then consistencies start. Point that she has no idea what went wrong. The next information that points to a serious problem. Do you know what actually occurred to you? On the internet, just one line ignited a fire. Social media began making connections in a matter of hours. Theories abound in comment sections. People watched the video again, scrutinizing time frames, nonverbal cues, and body language. And one name kept coming up during that maelstrom. Mendeecees doesn't happen because of something that has been verified or because of a police report. Rather, as someone calls you on it. You can then claim anything. What? I didn't do nothing. I didn't mention the... All right. Asking, are you what happened to you? No, I'm not. But it? I don't know what actually happened, but I can talk about it. Many thought transpired once the camera stopped. Then the atmosphere at a birthday celebration. Bothers me. That bothers me greatly because I'm telling you straight up that you were a bold-faced, bald-headed goddamn liar. All right, that evening was never concerning me. Zoe, you, and everyone else were... You guys asked me over the phone what was going on in my direction. Everything up my way closed. I said, I thought we could always get a new roof. What had begun as thoughts became accusations. The voice became more acute. It became to conceal the frustration. This was more than just Tamar, criticizing the story and claiming that emotions were wounded. As the narrative progressed to rage and to conflict, viewers watched. It became evident as they did with stories about betrayal and jail tests. Someone was being held accountable. Someone was under protection. Additionally, the story being given suggested that someone was not being completely honest. And when it seems that the story couldn't get much darker, Yandy's stillness turned into impossible to overlook. Because quiet is meaningful in circumstances such as these. It has great significance. And one question is forced by what happens next. It is no longer avoidable. Why did this story get so out of control if it was never meant to be made public? And who did lose control of it? The story continued even after the video stopped. It increased in number. The amount that was inferred in the gaps between sentences. Rather than what was stated explicitly, was what created the tense atmosphere. The speakers repeated the same night, place, the impression that if they enough, they actually allow the settle. Because based on the story being given, the evening wasn't chaotic or careless. At first, it wasn't even dramatic. It was meant to be ordinary. A birthday, a snack stop, a changing itinerary. Never the telling of the tale returned to the unsettling conclusion that nothing happened. The manner they were later portrayed, which was a paraphrasing of how they met up, made plans to eat, and ultimately ended up together. The timing wasn't the only thing that caught viewers' attention. It was the persistence, the repeated explanation that this was not some great gesture story in which you went to host a friend's birthday. Party and the friend mistreated you. Tamar, that is incorrect. Additionally, it's unfair to me, and it hurts my feelings. It's not a well-thought-out celebration, nor is it a time to be misinterpreted. It was evident from the voice's fury that someone had rewritten this night and sit well. And the internet took notice, because it became impossible to deny the contrasts when people began comparing what was said here with what had previously been shared online. The mood of the one ended during the interview. Something completely different was implied by the story that was circulating on social media. The tension increased at that point. The speaker does more than simply refute the narrative. They contest the motivation behind it. They wonder why the night was presented that way. Why were some details emphasized while others were subtly omitted? Significantly, why the narrative abruptly took on the emotional burden of something much more serious. Story. It hurts my sentiments. That line hit the ground hard, because at that passion shifted from memory to motivation. This was according to the account. This wasn't miscommunication. While others had to deal with the aftermath, this person was fabricating a version of events to make themselves appear mistreated. And the consequences followed quickly. Inconsistencies were pointed out some viewers. Why was the narrative altered? Why did some names come and go based on how it's told? What caused the tone to go from informal to disastrous? The charge itself wasn't the most frightening aspect. It was the assurance that accompanied it. I assumed they wanted to be up there alone since they were kissing in the back of that damned car. I didn't go upstairs when we were dropped off at Tamar's place because of this. You were sitting on his lap in that goddamn Uber while you two were kissing. So I got in my stupid car and drove home. All right. Additionally, the underscore made me, oh no. The speaker makes it apparent in the transcript that they were uneasy long before anything happened. Nor suspicious, nor envious, just uncomfortable, observing exchanges that didn't feel comfortable. You ran your head through the headboard or whatever and noticed underscore your ass from behind. Or be looked into regarding what level of intimacy. They had the impression that didn't ignore, but also didn't entirely comprehend.